They said the tarp was stretched flat and clean, not a single ripple. The bike leaned neatly beside it, kickstand still down. 4 arrows, wooden shafts, fletching bright, were planted in the ground like someone had drawn a quiet line. No footprints, no blood, no chaos. Just a red trailer, a blue tarp, and that impossible silence rising off the Sol Duke River. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Randy Mercer. I'm from Santa Cruz, California, and for most of my life I worked as a contractor. Steady work, good people, nothing fancy. I raised 2 kids with my ex-wife Mallory and Jacob. Our marriage didn't hold, but the kids were everything to us. Jacob was different even when he was little. He liked time alone, hiking, sketching, reading things I never touched. Quiet, but not withdrawn. He was kind, thoughtful, always off building something in the garage or climbing hills with no trail. After the divorce, we all drifted in our own ways. Jacob took it harder than he let on. He lost the house he grew up in, his routine, his footing. I thought he was just figuring himself out like all young men do at that age. It was in March when he told me about the bike trip. Said he was heading east Vermont, he thought. Clear across the country. He had a plan written in pencil and 2 Bibles in his bag. I helped him pack his trailer, watched him test out a little cook stove he bought. He said he needed to get away from all the noise. Just a bit of space, Dad. That's all. I remember watching him ride away from the driveway, the sun just coming up behind the cypress trees. His helmet a little too loose. One last wave without turning around. That was April 4th. At first, it felt like any other long-distance trip. Mallory and I texted now and then, waiting for updates. Jacob wasn't the type to call much, but by April 7th, we still hadn't heard a word. Then a ranger from Olympic National Park called, said he'd found a number written inside a gear pouch, said they'd come across some camping equipment and a red trailer by the river. He asked if I had a son named Jacob, and that's when everything slowed down. I didn't ask many questions. I just threw my wetsuit into the truck, filled the tank, and started driving north. Got pulled over somewhere near Eugene, doing over 100. The trooper asked where I was going in such a hurry. I told him. He just nodded and said, "Be careful." And by the time I reached Washington, the sun was setting low behind the trees. And all I could think was Jacob should have been halfway to Idaho by now. But his bike was still there, waiting. And he wasn't. They walked me down to the site just after sunrise. The ranger didn't say much on the drive, just pointed out landmarks along Sol Duke Road in that low, matter-of-fact tone people use when they're trying not to get your hopes up. I remember the clouds hanging low across the ridge, the mist creeping through the trees, and the sound of river water moving hard over stone. The spot wasn't far from the road, maybe 10 yards, if that. You could see it from the gravel shoulder, no brush covering it, nothing hidden. Just Jacob's bike leaned against a mossy stump trailer still attached and a tarp laid out on the ground like he'd been sorting his gear. Nothing was packed, nothing stashed. Sleeping bag, stove, some books, socks still rolled. His boots were sitting neatly beside the tarp like someone had stepped out of them and walked away barefoot. That's what got me. He was a neat kid, sure, but this felt staged, intentional, but unfinished, as if he meant to return in 5 minutes and never did. Then there were the arrows. 4 of them, stuck upright in the dirt, spaced evenly pointing east to west. No signs of target practice, no marks on the trees. Just a straight line of shafts near the tarp, their fletching barely moving in the morning wind. The ranger said they were the only thing that didn't make sense. I didn't tell him, but they made perfect sense to me. Jacob didn't leave things by accident. The last time I saw him practicing with those arrows, he told me something odd. He said, "They help me focus, Dad. I don't even care about hitting the target." I didn't ask what that meant. Now I wished I had. The gear hadn't been ransacked. No signs of animals, no footprints around the site, no drag marks, no blood. The bike was fully functional tires, inflated, chain oiled. Even the kickstand was down, like he'd simply parked and walked off into the woods, but walked where there were no trails branching out from that stretch of road. And the river, fast and loud and bone-cold, rushed barely 20 feet from the gear. I walked to the edge and stood there a long time. The ranger said it was possible Jacob went down to get water and slipped in. Sol Duke runs hard in April snowmelt-fed high volume. If someone went in fully clothed, they'd last maybe 5-10 minutes at most. But the thing was, if he had slipped, we'd have seen some kind of sign. A scuff in the moss, a broken branch, something. The river didn't explain the boots left behind. It didn't explain why his jacket was missing, but his food wasn't. That same afternoon, another ranger, Ray, I think his name was, came back with a list he'd found in one of Jacob's gear pouches. On it were a few phone numbers, mine and Mallory's among them. They called her first. I don't know what that conversation sounded like, but when she reached me, her voice was brittle. "Dad," she said, "they found his stuff, just sitting there." I told her I was already in Washington. She flew out the next day. Laura, my ex, didn't come right away. We weren't on the best terms back then. But she called me that night. Quiet at first, then angry. Why didn't anyone call us sooner? I didn't have an answer. Turns out Jacob's gear had been sitting by that river for 3 days before anyone connected the dots. 3 days. The park staff thought he'd just wandered off on a day hike. And because no one filed a missing person report because no one knew till they didn't start a search. I kept asking why helicopters hadn't been sent up, why dog teams weren't on site. Ray shrugged and said there'd been a plane crash that week and another missing person case closer to Hurricane Ridge. I looked at him and said, "So what's my son to you? A paperwork backlog?" Mallory tried to be diplomatic. She asked about bringing in volunteer search teams from Oregon. Said there were dog handlers ready to deploy within hours, but the park had protocols. Outside teams weren't allowed without formal approval. Coast Guard was nearby minutes away by air, but their help was declined too. I started to see it then. Not malice, just bureaucracy. Indifference shaped by policy and underfunding. They weren't going to look for my son unless someone forced them to. So I did. I waded into that river in a wetsuit and gloves, dived behind every log jam I could reach, searched under low falls and behind moss-covered boulders that hadn't been moved in years. The water was in the high 30s, enough to shock your breath from your lungs even in neoprene. I started developing trench foot from hours in wet socks. My gloves tore open in the brush. Devil's Club ripped through them like paper, leaving my hands raw and bleeding. But I kept going, because not finding a body meant maybe he was still alive. A few days later, one of the volunteers found a pair of shorts snagged in driftwood a couple miles downstream. Looked like Jacob's size. Sent to the crime lab in Seattle. Came back negative. Not his. That was the start of the false leads. We'd get sightings. A guy with a red trailer in Port Angeles. A young man walking alone on Fairholme Hill at night. They all turned to dust. Someone claimed to have seen him at a gas station on Highway 101. Mallory followed up personally. She showed the clerk a photo. He just shook his head. Olympic Mountain Rescue showed up a week later. Good people, volunteers. They knew the terrain. Said tracking this long after the fact was tough, especially with weather rolling in and snow still heavy in the higher elevations. But they tried. Found signs of something by the riverbank, a shift from boot prints to lighter tread, maybe running shoes. A scuff on a mossy stone like someone slipped. A disturbance in the mud 30 yards downstream, as if someone had climbed back out. But all of it was guesswork. Could have been him. Could have been a fisherman. Could have been no one. 2 cadaver dogs hit on a log jam downriver. Their handlers got hopeful. Divers went in. They pulled every piece apart. Nothing. Scent could have been anything: animal runoff, trace, human remains washed downstream. Still, I marked the spot. Went back to it twice a day for a week, just in case the river gave something up. But it never did. By the end of that second week, the park quietly shifted Jacob's case to what they called a passive search. No more active resources. Unless new evidence came forward, that was it. I remember standing outside the ranger station looking at their bulletin board. Someone had stapled a flyer about wildflower tours next to Jacob's missing poster. And I thought my son's out there somewhere and they've moved on to flowers. That night I told Mallory I wasn't going home. I didn't even mean to say it out loud, but it came out like a decision that had already been made. I sold the business a few days later, signed over the keys to the house, picked up a diesel truck and a slide-in camper. I wasn't just going to look for Jacob on weekends. I was going to live where he disappeared. Before I left that parking lot, I opened the back of the camper and set 4 arrows across the counter. Not because I thought they'd help me find him, but because they were the last thing he touched. And somehow they were pointing me forward. I started putting up flyers in every post office and coffee shop from Forks to Port Townsend. Just a simple photo of Jacob his age, what he was wearing, the red trailer. A few people remembered seeing him. One man near Indian Valley said he'd passed a cyclist early morning on April 5th pulling gear uphill in the dark. A woman out near Fairholme Hill told me she'd seen someone matching Jacob's description at 1 in the morning. Same red trailer, same hunched posture like he was pushing hard against a load that didn't want to move. But it was what she saw later that stuck with me. She'd been driving back down from the ridge just after sunrise and spotted something by the river. His trailer, the tarp. It stood out to her, looked too neat to be abandoned, but too exposed to belong to someone still nearby. She stopped and took a photo, thinking maybe he was just up the trail organizing his things. That picture became the first time-stamped image we had of the gear before the Rangers showed up the next morning. When I asked her why she didn't call it in, she hesitated. It didn't look wrong, she said. It just looked unfinished. For days, I hoped one of those early sightings would break the case open. That someone had stopped to talk to him, offered him a ride, anything. But when Rangers followed up, nobody had more to give. No names, no plates, just vague impressions of a lone cyclist heading west when everything on his itinerary said he should have been going east. The plan he'd given Mallory weeks earlier had been all about Vermont. He'd mapped out stops through the Rockies and the Midwest. There was nothing in that plan that led to the Olympic Peninsula. And yet, here we were. I started to wonder if he'd told anyone the truth, if maybe that itinerary had only been meant to put us at ease. Mallory said she'd felt something off even before he left. She said he'd been quiet, not in his usual way, but withdrawn. Like he was holding something in and didn't know how to name it. Laura mentioned he'd been reading more scripture than usual, kept his grandfather's Bible close. Not the new one I bought him, the old one cracked and taped along the spine. That one had pages dog-eared and verses circled. She found one he'd marked with a pen, Isaiah 34:14. Something about desert creatures and night spirits. It wasn't a passage of comfort. It read more like a warning, or maybe a direction. But when we brought those things up to the rangers, they just listened politely and nodded. I could see it in their eyes they'd moved on. They had forms to fill, boxes to check. Unless a body surfaced or a footprint showed up with clean tread, there wasn't much more they were going to do. When Mallory pressed Ranger Ray about bringing in dogs again, maybe from Oregon this time, he told her it had to go through the superintendent. That request never went anywhere. We offered to bring our own team, paid, certified. He said he couldn't authorize it, so I started knocking on doors. Homeless shelters, outreach clinics, tents pitched in the back lots of Port Angeles and Aberdeen. I brought copies of Jacob's photo and passed them out to anyone who'd take one. Some people waved me off. Others took the flyer, looked close, and said maybe they'd seen him, but every lead ended the same way. Someone vaguely familiar. Someone maybe asking for work. Someone with a pack, but no red trailer. Nothing held. Still, I kept going. Daytime I searched the woods. Nighttime I walked city streets. At 2 a.m. one night I sat on a bus bench beside a man who smelled like wet leaves and motor oil. He pointed at Jacob's picture and said, "He looks like someone who got off the grid." I didn't say anything, just sat there in the cold. There were times I started to wonder if maybe he had disappeared on purpose. Mallory voiced it first. Said she thought Jacob was lost, not physically, but mentally. That he didn't know what he wanted to be or where he belonged. That the world had pushed in too hard and he didn't know how to push back. Laura said the same thing in a different way. He was having trouble adulting, she told me, like it was a phrase she'd picked up from somewhere else. And maybe she was right. The loss of the house hit him harder than either of us expected. The quiet routines he'd grown up with, chopping firewood, cooking eggs on Sundays, fixing leaky faucets, those things gave him shape. When they disappeared, maybe part of him did too. That summer I took a ferry out to the San Juan Islands thinking maybe Jacob had found a place to work off-grid. An organic farm. A wildlife sanctuary. Something remote enough to avoid questions, but still reachable if you knew where to look. I rode a folding bike from island to island, stopping in co-ops and feed stores, talking to anyone who'd listen. Most had never heard of him. One woman said she thought she'd seen someone like that picking apples last fall. We followed up. It wasn't him. Back in the mountains, I kept returning to that stretch of river. 12 miles between the point where his gear was found and the first heavy rapids. I walked it in both directions. Marked it with chalk and tape, took water samples, counted tree limbs. I mapped out every place a body might get caught, every log jam that could hold weight, every shelf of rock that formed an underwater pocket. I searched all of them, and every time I came up empty, I circled back to the same thing. Why leave the gear so visible? If he was planning to vanish, why not hide it? If he fell in, why leave behind the boots? Why take the jacket? Why the arrows? I kept going over it again and again, and the only thing I could think was, none of this makes sense if you're running from something. But it does start to make sense if you're going towards something. One morning in late May, I found myself just staring at those arrows again. I had them laid out across the counter in the camper, just like the day I left the ranger station. East to west, exactly like they'd been planted. I stared at them so long I forgot I was supposed to eat. Forgot what day it was. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been lost at all. Maybe he'd been aiming. I stopped checking the calendar sometime in early June. Couldn't have told you what day of the week it was unless someone asked directly. Even then, I usually guessed wrong. My phone stayed off most of the time, and the only mail I bothered opening were maps I'd ordered or lists of elevation data I'd asked to be printed. The days started blending together in that way they do when everything depends on weather and light. What the clouds were doing in the valley, whether the frost broke by noon, how long I could stand in the river before my feet went numb. I'd set up camp just a few miles from where Jacob's trailer was found. It wasn't legal, not really, but no one was stopping me anymore. I kept a low profile, moved the camper every few days to avoid suspicion. If a ranger asked, I said I was scouting photo locations for a hiking guide. I didn't look like a threat. By then, I barely looked like myself. I remember the moment it changed from a search to an obsession. I'd found a copy of a topographic map that showed the ridgelines above Hull Lake steep and bare, all marked with old avalanche patterns. I hadn't looked at that area before, too far from the river, too exposed, but something about the slope struck me. It was climbable. Not safe, but climbable. And there was a line almost hidden in the contour shading that led to a saddle between two ridges. No trails, just geography. I marked it with a red pencil, the same shade as Jacob's trailer. I didn't tell Mallory where I was going that week. She'd been calling less. I think part of her was trying to find distance to start accepting what I wasn't ready to. I didn't blame her. Everyone grieves their own way. Hers was quiet and private. Mine was louder, physical. I couldn't stop moving. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking brought me right back to the arrows. I started walking a loop every day, sometimes 5, sometimes 8 miles, depending on weather. I made mental notes of tree patterns, ground cover, animal signs. I scanned tree trunks for marks, measured distances from water sources. I told myself that if Jacob had gone up instead of down, he might have left something small, a thread, a scrape on bark, a broken twig near a slope edge. Once I found a coin wedged in moss, just a nickel, not Jacob's. Still, I pocketed it, started carrying it like a charm. That's how far gone I was. Laura finally flew up in mid-June. She wanted to help, but the weight of the place wore on her fast. She lasted 3 days. On the second night, she sat across from me at the fire and said, "He's not out here, Randy." I didn't answer. I just stirred the pot of beans we hadn't eaten. She left before sunrise the next morning, slipped a letter in the glove box before she went. I read it once and tucked it under the seat. It said she admired me, said she hoped I'd come back before I broke myself. That was the word she used. Broke. Like a tool that can't be used anymore. By late July, I'd lost 15 pounds and couldn't bend my left knee all the way without pain. My right hand had cracked in 3 spots from cold and wet. Still, I kept searching. I worked alongside some of the Olympic mountain response guys when they could spare time. Derek Randalls and his team. They didn't make promises, but they never stopped showing up. They'd logged more ground than I ever could have on my own 700 miles easy. Some of it bush so thick you had to crawl through it sideways. But they believed in the search. Not just for Jacob. For everyone who vanished up here. They told me once you could stack all the missing persons cases from the peninsula into one file cabinet and still not have the whole picture. The wilderness takes people. That's what it does. But not like this. Not Jacob. Not like this. One afternoon, I sat by the river and wrote Jacob's name in the dirt with a stick. The current was high, churning with silt from the glacier melt. I watched it for almost an hour, half expecting anything to float into view. Nothing ever did. I kept thinking about what he'd left behind. The throwing knives I gave him for Christmas weren't among his gear. Neither was his alpine jacket or his crampons. That meant he'd taken them with him. That meant intention. That meant movement. I started to wonder if I'd been wrong to focus on the river all this time. Maybe the water hadn't taken him. Maybe he'd gone the other way. It was late August, full moon red as rust from the wildfire smoke drifting down from British Columbia. I was sleeping in the camper outside a place called The Barn. Bigfoot researchers owned the land. They let me stay there between search routes. Strange crowd rifle cases, plaster casts of footprints charging stations for thermal gear, but they respected the mountain. They helped more than anyone else. That night I lay awake listening to coyotes in the valley below, and it hit me that I hadn't spoken to anyone in nearly 30 hours. I tried to remember the last full sentence I'd said out loud. I couldn't. The next morning I hiked up past Deer Lake into the switchbacks that led to the upper basin. I'd gone part way before, never all the way. Something always pulled me back, whether exhaustion, self-doubt. But not that day. I made it to the ridge around 800 feet before the wind picked up. The trees disappeared, replaced by rock and snow patches. I remember stopping to eat, staring out at the line of peaks that rolled out toward the horizon. They were quiet, steady, unmoved by any of it. I started back down just after noon. That night I got a call from one of the park staff. A team of biologists had been up near Hull Lake monitoring marmot activity. They'd found something. Remains. Human. Off-trail, high ridge, remote. They hadn't confirmed anything yet. Dental records would be needed, but the altitude, the location, it didn't fit any of the other open cases. Only one name came up. Mine. The ranger told me not to go up there, that it was a restricted scene now. "Let us handle this, Mr. Mercer," he said. I didn't answer right away. Just stood in the gravel lot behind the station phone pressed to my ear, river wind cutting through my jacket. Then I said, "When does a dad stop being a dad?" He didn't have an answer. I left before sunrise, didn't tell anyone. I took the back trail, passed the logging road, and started climbing. And as I made my way higher into that ridge line, I'd only traced on paper something in me settled. Not at peace, but steady. Like I was finally following the same path Jacob might have taken. By the time I reached the upper shelf, the sun was low behind the trees. I didn't find him, not directly, but I came across 2 rangers working on a woman who'd collapsed from cardiac arrest. I helped where I could. Chest compressions, oxygen, whatever they asked. She didn't make it. One of the rangers, young guy, red hair, recognized my name. He was part of the team that had carried Jacob's remains down the slope earlier that morning. He said nothing at first, just nodded once. Then he reached into his coat and handed me a small laminated photo. It was Jacob, an ID still tucked in his coat pocket. Same faint smile. Same eyes. After all those months, it looked like he'd been waiting. After they confirmed it was Jacob, everything slowed down in a strange way. You'd think something would snap into place or collapse or burn through, but it didn't. It just went still. The coroner from Clallam County called a few days later, said the remains had been identified through dental records. They couldn't give me an exact cause of death. Inconclusive, the report said. No signs of trauma, no broken bones. He'd had insulated clothes on, carried food, a lighter, and a Bible, his grandfather's, the one with the cracked leather binding. Everything pointed to someone who knew how to survive. And yet he hadn't. They said hypothermia was likely, but that only answered how. It didn't tell me why. That ridge where they found him, it was miles from where the trailer had been, and higher, almost 300 feet. Not near a trail, not even close to one. In early April, that terrain would have been buried under snow. Avalanches were common up there. No shelter, no signage, Nothing to orient yourself except wind and stone. It didn't make sense. If you were lost, you'd head downhill, toward water, toward roads, toward help. Jacob had done the opposite. He'd gone up, chosen the hardest route with the fewest markers. The more I stared at those topographic lines on the map, the more something began to settle in me. That ridge wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. I went through his gear again a few days after the confirmation. Just sat on the edge of the camper bed and opened every pouch, every zipper. Some of it smelled like river still, like wet moss and tarp. I laid the contents out carefully, trying to understand the logic of what he'd packed and what he hadn't. That's when I noticed the jacket, the heavy one. It wasn't the one I'd given him before the trip. It was older, more worn, something he'd pulled from a storage bin years ago. And the crampons, those had always been stored with his climbing gear, not his cycling gear. Same with the folding knife I didn't recognize. I started to think maybe this trip wasn't about Vermont at all. I brought it up with Mallory the next day. She didn't argue, said she'd thought that too, that maybe he told us what we needed to hear just to be left alone. He'd been quieter in those last few weeks. Not withdrawn exactly, more like focused. She remembered one night when he showed her a notebook full of rotes he'd scribbled by hand. Mountain names, elevations, rivers, none of them eastbound, all west, north, high-altitude terrain. She hadn't made much of it then, but now she wished she'd asked him more questions. I kept going back to the 4 arrows, stuck in the ground near the tarp, east to west, evenly spaced, like a signal or a compass. I don't think they were meant for anyone else. I think they were for him. A marker. A last deliberate act before he turned and walked away. I remember how carefully he used to line things up when he was a boy, his shoes, his pencils, the labels on his climbing gear. That wasn't coincidence. That was Jacob. There were a lot of theories floating around that summer. Some people said he might have had a psychotic break, that maybe the stress and isolation got to him. Others floated ideas about cults or people living off-grid who lured him away. I chased all of it down, every lead, every story, every weird article someone emailed me at 3 a.m., but none of it fit. None of it sounded like Jacob. There was no fear in the way he left that gear behind. No panic, no rush. It looked like someone moving with purpose. One night I found myself parked along the edge of a turnout above the Sol Duc River, not far from where the gear was first found. I sat there in the dark with the camper windows down, listening to the water. I kept thinking about that Bible verse, Isaiah 34:14, the one Jacob had circled. I pulled it up again, reread it slowly. The desert creature shall meet with the wolves. The night monster shall settle there. It wasn't a verse of comfort. It was wild, untamed. But I wondered if Jacob read it differently. If, to him, it wasn't a warning. It was a direction. That same week I met with a man named Dr. Robert Kester. He worked in behavioral search theory, wrote a manual used in a lot of SAR training. We talked for over an hour. I laid out everything Jacob's habits, the gear, the direction he'd gone. Kester told me something I didn't expect. He said, when people are truly searching for clarity, for peace, for something bigger than themselves, they don't follow the usual patterns. They go up. Children do it. People on vision quests, hikers in spiritual distress. They climb. Not because it makes sense on a map, but because something inside them is pointing that way. I didn't say much after that, just nodded. He wasn't offering closure. He was offering a lens, a way of looking at all the pieces without forcing them into a box that didn't fit. Later that month, I hiked the ridge where Jacob was found. I didn't tell anyone I was going. Just parked the truck at the trailhead and started early. I didn't bring much, just a day pack water and the old arrows. I wrapped them in cloth and tucked them into my jacket. It was slow going. That kind of climb never gives anything back easy. But when I reached the top, I stood in the place the biologists had marked on their map. It was quiet, bright. The sun was high and the wind steady. You could see the whole basin from up there, the curve of the ridge, the line of trees far below the shimmer of the lake beyond. I laid the arrows down gently just behind a boulder that faced east. Then I sat. I don't know how long. Long enough for the wind to shift and the shadows to move. Long enough to realize Jacob hadn't come here to die. He'd come here to find something. Peace, purpose. Maybe even a voice that made sense in a world that hadn't made sense to him in a long time. As I made my way back down, I passed a small cairn someone had built along the saddle. Could have been any hiker. Could have been nothing. But it looked deliberate, balanced, familiar. And for a moment, I let myself believe he'd stood there too. Just for a minute, looking out at the same horizon. Quiet, steady, unafraid. The morning after I left the arrows on the ridge, I drove back down through the valley with the windows cracked just enough to let the wind pass through. There was still smoke in the air from the wildfires up north. Everything had a muted smell, pine and ash and something faintly metallic. I didn't turn the radio on. I didn't call anyone. I just followed the winding road east until the asphalt flattened out and I found a turnout where I could park the truck and sit without being in anyone's way. It had been nearly 5 months since Jacob left Santa Cruz. Almost a year since I'd touched anything resembling a normal routine. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped being a search and started becoming something else, something more private, more stripped down. What began as urgency had turned into ritual. I woke. I walked. I scanned tree lines. I noted cloud shape and moss texture, and how many minutes past sunrise the light hit a particular rock face. I was keeping a vigil even if I hadn't called it that out loud. A few days later, I went back to the park office. The staff had been polite since the discovery, but distant. I understood it. They had procedures, language they were allowed to use. Everything had to be measured and phrased with care. I asked for a copy of the full field report, the one from the biologists who found him. It took a while, but they handed it over. I read it in the cab of my truck engine off breeze, pushing through the passenger side window. The report mentioned marmot burrows, an unusual trail of disturbed stones, a glint of metal from 20 yards off, which turned out to be the zipper on Jacob's jacket. No signs of a struggle. No damage to the surrounding brush. Just one still body on the far side of a granite outcrop, curled slightly like he'd laid down to rest. I stared at the phrase. No indications of disorientation or distress. The biologists hadn't found chaos. They'd found quiet. And for some reason that landed harder than anything else. It meant he hadn't stumbled there. He hadn't clawed his way to the top in desperation. He'd climbed deliberately. And when he reached that spot, he'd stayed. Not because he couldn't move, but because, for whatever reason, he didn't want to. Back at the camper that night, I pulled out the small notebook where I'd been keeping field notes. I flipped past the maps and supply lists and waterway diagrams until I reached the blank pages in the back. I drew the ridge from memory, then shaded the pocket where the remains had been found. Below that, I wrote down a question I hadn't let myself ask directly until then. What was he expecting to find up there? The next few weeks passed in a kind of haze. I moved through town slowly, stopped for gas, picked up a replacement headlamp at the outfitter's store. People recognized me, but no one spoke unless I spoke first. A few offered condolences. One woman gave me a folded note and said, "He looked like someone searching for silence." I kept the note, tucked it between the pages of the notebook. Eventually, I found myself drawn back to the place where the trailer had been left. It was bare now, no sign of tarp or gear, just an uneven patch of grass and a section of flattened soil. The river, as always, was moving fast, cold and clean and louder than it looked. I walked the bank for an hour, then sat near the same rock where I'd first seen the tire marks. This time I was looking for something different. Not signs of Jacob, but signs of me. What had I missed that day? What assumption had I carried in with me that had bent the truth just enough to lead me wrong? There was a section of moss-covered stone about 10 feet out from the trail that caught my eye. Slight discoloration, faint scuff marks too subtle for a rescue team rushing through in April, but easier to see now with summer drying things out. I stepped closer. The moss had been disturbed, not torn. Pressed, like someone had sat there for a moment, shifted their weight, then stood again. I took a photo, not because I thought it would change anything, but because I'd learned to treat even the smallest irregularities with care. Sometimes the story of a person's last movements isn't written in grand gestures. It's written in weight transfer and leaf tilt and the angle of a heel mark beneath the dirt. I sent the photo to Mallory. She didn't say much in reply. Just, "Thank you." I didn't blame her. She was grieving in her own rhythm, processing the loss in a way that kept her connected to Jacob without pulling her under. Laura called a few days later and asked if I was ready to come home. I told her not yet. She didn't argue. Instead, I started to think differently about the whole map. Not just where he went, but why he stopped where he did. I talked to a few SAR veterans, quiet men with weathered jackets and soft voices. One of them, a retired tracker named Glenn, told me something I hadn't heard before. He said sometimes when people are trying to listen for something bigger than themselves, they go where the signal feels clearest. It's not about safety, he said. It's about alignment. Like tuning a dial. He didn't elaborate, he didn't need to. So I started looking for those places. High ridges, exposed shelves, natural amphitheaters where wind carried sound differently. I started mapping them not because I expected to find Jacob again, but because I wanted to understand the logic he might have used. And the more I looked, the more I realized something every place I marked had one thing in common. It offered distance. Not just elevation, but separation. A place where the noise of the world fell away, and only one voice remained your own. I kept the arrows. I didn't bring them back to the ridge. I didn't bury them or hang them in the camper. I just kept them wrapped in cloth beside the stove within reach. Sometimes I'd unroll them and hold one by the shaft, feel the balance point. It wasn't grief, exactly. It was something slower, older, like I was carrying part of the message he never finished writing. And then about a week into September, I found a contradiction I couldn't quite explain. Going through the photos again, the ones the ranger had taken of the tarp site, I noticed something odd in the background. A faint smudge of fabric caught on a branch deeper in the frame near the river bend. I hadn't noticed it before. I pulled up the high-resolution file, zoomed in, and there it was, a strip of dark material twisted in the brush. Could have been nothing. Could have been a shadow, but it was there in every shot from every angle. I marked the location on the map and packed a day bag. The next morning, I headed back to the river for one more look. I didn't know what I'd find, if anything, but something about that small detail pulled at me. A piece of the picture still out of place, still waiting, and after everything else, I couldn't let it go. Not yet. I returned to that bend in the river just after sunrise. The light was still coming in low, sliding between the trees and catching on the wet rocks like scattered glass. I had marked the spot on an old printout from the ranger's file, taped it next to a hand-drawn grid I'd made the night before. I wasn't expecting anything, not really. But I'd learned that in the woods, the smallest shift, a discolored root, a pressed leaf, a thread caught in the brush could carry more weight than a full trail of footprints. It was quiet out there, cold for early September. The river moved fast and sharp, pulling steam off the surface like breath. I walked the bank slowly, scanning everything in a tight arc. That strip of fabric I'd seen in the photo was still there. Same twist, same sag, wedged where two limbs had broken and split in opposite directions. It was a torn piece of nylon dark green frayed along the edges. Looked like it had been sliced, not pulled. I crouched beside it for a long time, just staring. It didn't match anything from Jacob's gear that I remembered. Not the tarp, not the sleeping bag, not the jacket I'd seen in the final inventory. I took a photo, bagged it in a freezer pouch, and tucked it into the front of my pack. On the way back to the truck, I tried not to make more of it than it was. It could have come from anything, a camper, a hiker, even an old fisherman's coat. Still, it was less than 40 yards from the tarp site, right in line with the direction Jacob would have had to walk if he'd gone toward the deeper water. The location didn't prove anything, but it leaned me back toward a thought I hadn't wanted to revisit. That maybe he didn't climb right away. That maybe he had gone to the river first, either to fill a bottle or for some other reason, and that something changed his course. Something shifted his direction from water to elevation. I went back through my notes that night. The early sightings, the timeline, the details I hadn't looked at in months. And I saw it again, something I'd skimmed before but hadn't focused on. The ranger's initial comment that the boots had been left behind. Not just set aside, but lined up neatly beside the tarp. But the search team found signs of lighter shoe prints near the river, closer to where the moss was disturbed. Jacob had changed footwear, from boots to running shoes. Who does that if they're planning a hard climb? I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the sequence: bike, trailer, tarp, the arrows in the dirt, and then the shoes. The decision to change them meant intention, maybe even urgency. I started wondering if someone had approached him at that site, not necessarily with force, maybe with a request. Maybe a stranger asked for help, told a story that pulled Jacob's attention toward the river or deeper into the woods. The idea had crossed my mind before someone luring him, but I'd dismissed it. No evidence, no witnesses. But now that piece of nylon, it changed something. Not because it was proof, but because it didn't belong. Jacob didn't carry excess. He didn't use tarps for warmth unless they were part of his packed gear. And if something got sliced, it meant a blade. I started wondering what else I'd accepted too easily. Later that week, I drove out to Port Angeles and sat with a man I'd spoken to once before, a retired SAR tech named Cal Forrester. He wasn't with the park anymore. He'd started a consulting group after retiring. Small-town guy, soft-spoken, slow to answer, but thoughtful when he did. I showed him the nylon. He turned it over a few times, then set it down and asked if I remembered what model knife Jacob had packed. I told him I did not exactly, just that it was small and foldable, something he'd had since high school. Cal nodded. Then he asked something I hadn't expected. "You ever consider he wasn't alone that night?" I didn't say anything at first, just waited. Cal went on carefully. Said he'd seen situations where missing persons weren't truly solo. People assume solo hikers go missing because they made a mistake or underestimated the terrain. But sometimes, he said, people meet someone at a trailhead, strike up a conversation, agree to walk a short stretch together. Sometimes it's nothing. Other times, it becomes something else. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a theory. Just a reminder that not every disappearance is purely internal. Some are shaped by who we meet and when. Cal offered to have the nylon tested. I agreed. Gave him the sample in a sealed bag. He didn't make promises, just said he'd log it and see what he could find out. As I was leaving, he told me he'd recently reviewed another cold file. Young man similar age went missing near Lake Crescent 3 years earlier. Gear found. No remains. Only common thread was a pair of shoe prints that seemed to change direction halfway through the last known route. One set going toward the water, the other sharply uphill. Back in the truck, I sat with the engine off and the windows down. Mallory called while I was still parked in front of the co-op. She didn't know where I was, just said she felt like checking in. I told her about the nylon, about Cal, about the footprints. There was a pause on the line. Then she said, "Dad, I think you're circling the answer, but you're not going to like it when it comes." She didn't say more than that. She didn't have to. I knew what she meant. That at some point I'd have to accept there was no answer that would feel right. Still, I couldn't let it go. Not yet. That night I pulled out the photo of the tarp site again, the first one taken by the woman on Fairholme Hill. In the background, barely visible, there was something I hadn't noticed before. A figure. Blurred. Distant. Off to the left in the tree line. It could have been a shadow or a trick of the light. But it had the posture of a person. Upright. Angled toward the river. I zoomed in. The pixels broke down, but the shape remained. I stared at it for a long time. Then I made a copy and marked it with a red pen. The next morning I drove back to that exact spot. I brought a rangefinder and a tape measure. I stood where the photo had been taken and traced the angle to the tree line. 70 feet out there was a patch of soft ground where the needles hadn't settled evenly. No tracks, no markings left after all these months, but enough of a dip to suggest that someone might have been standing there. Watching. Waiting. Or just passing through. I didn't know which. I still don't. But that shape in the photo, it wasn't Jacob. He'd already moved on by then. And whoever it was, they never came forward. I stood at that tree line for a long time watching how the sun moved through the limbs. Same place as in the photograph, same angle, same spacing. It was quiet out there, but not the kind of quiet that settles. The kind that waits. I kept checking the ground, the slope, anything that could tell me who had been standing there that morning and what they might have seen. But there was nothing left to find. The needles had thickened. Rain had washed most of the soft indentations away. Whatever sign had been there, it was gone now. And the figure in that photograph, blurred, still almost incidental, never came forward. No hiker report. No matching clothing description from the sightings earlier that week. Just a shape caught in the background of a photo no one was supposed to take. I sent it to the Rangers just in case. They acknowledged it, added it to the file, and that was that. I stopped expecting answers after that. Not because I didn't care anymore, but because something shifted in me. I'd crossed a line somewhere between searching for Jacob and preserving what was left of him. The last few months had turned that difference into a weight I couldn't shake. People said the case was closed, that it was a tragedy, an accident, a young man who got in over his head. But they were wrong. Jacob didn't get lost. He walked. He chose. And whatever happened out there, whether someone approached him or he turned away from something on his own, it wasn't a mistake. The coroner's report came in soon after. Still inconclusive, no trauma, no sign of foul play. Official cause listed as presumed hypothermia. But the phrasing left room like it was holding back the final word. I asked if they could confirm how long he'd been at that ridge before he died. They couldn't. No exact markers, just estimates based on condition and exposure. The assumption was that he'd passed within a few days of the last sighting, which meant for all our efforts, for all the days I spent diving into that river, crawling through ice-cold pools and tracking false leads, he was already gone. By the time I reached Washington, before the first dog team was ever approved, before the Coast Guard got denied, he was lying on a high ridge under snow. Quiet. Unmoving. Waiting for spring to thaw the path back to him. I didn't tell Mallory right away. I waited until we were both back in Santa Cruz, sitting on the back deck of the house we used to live in. The new owners let us visit, said we could walk the yard, see the garden. It had been Jacob's favorite spot. He used to string lights along the fence during winter, even when no one asked him to. Mallory sat in the same chair he always used, tilted back just enough that the legs scraped. She looked older, not tired, just changed. I handed her the folder and didn't say anything. She read it quietly, flipping pages in that slow, careful way she had. When she was done, she closed it, rested her hands on the cover, and said, "He died where he wanted to be." I nodded. I didn't say the part I was thinking, that he died before anyone gave him a real chance to live differently. In the weeks after that, I started getting more calls than I expected. Not from media, not even from the park, just people. Fathers, siblings, folks I'd never met who'd seen a flyer or heard about Jacob through the search forums. They wanted to know how I kept going, how I stayed out there that long, what I'd do different. What I saw. I didn't have advice. All I could offer was the truth as I'd lived it, that the worst part wasn't not knowing. It was knowing too late. That when help finally came, it was for the story, not for the boy who disappeared beneath it. And that even if you search every inch of a river walk, every trail, climb every ridge, sometimes it still ends in silence. One man asked if I'd forgiven the park staff. I told him I didn't think forgiveness was the point. They did what they could under the weight they were carrying: budget cuts, red tape, other emergencies stacking up. It wasn't personal, but it wasn't right either. Jacob's case was classified as passive less than 2 weeks in. That meant no more coordinated efforts unless new evidence surfaced. What they didn't understand, what maybe no system like that can fully understand, is that a passive search sends a message. It tells the family we've moved on. You're on your own now. And I was. From that moment on, every dive I took, every map I traced, every sleepless night in the camper, I carried it by myself, because no one else would. Eventually, I sent a formal letter to the park superintendent. Not out of anger, but to document it all. The missed window, the denial of outside help, the internal delays. I kept it measured, factual. I didn't ask for an apology, just acknowledgement. It took months, but I got a reply. A page and a half typed. It offered condolences, outlined policy changes they were reviewing, promised to reevaluate how missing persons cases were triaged. I don't know if anything changed because of it, but I wanted something in writing, Something for the next father who showed up at their office asking if his son was worth a helicopter. The nylon fabric I'd found near the river came back from the lab. No DNA, no unique markings. A common material used in outdoor gear tents and hunting jackets. No way to trace it. Just one more piece of a puzzle I couldn't finish. Cal called to tell me himself. Said he was sorry. Said he'd keep it logged in case something turned up years down the line. I thanked him. That night I burned the photocopies. I didn't need to hold on to every mystery anymore. I visited the ridge one more time before the snow returned. Hiked it slow. Brought a new tarp and a small wooden marker I carved myself. I didn't leave flowers. I didn't say a prayer. I just sat there until the wind shifted and the light changed. Then I packed my bag and started down. I don't know if Jacob was trying to leave a message with those arrows. I don't know if he ever meant for anyone to follow. But if he did, I hope I made it far enough to find where the line ended. Or at least close enough that he would have heard me coming. I keep Jacob's arrows in a wooden box now. Not displayed, just stored, wrapped in the same cloth I used when I carried them up to the ridge. I thought about leaving them there, but it didn't feel right. They weren't a message to the world. They were something personal, part of a path he laid down that only he understood. I've stopped trying to translate it. These days, I just hold on to the fact that he left something behind at all. Mallory visits sometimes. She doesn't bring it up unless I do, but when she talks about Jacob, she always uses the present tense. I noticed it once and asked if she meant to. She said no, but maybe she wasn't ready to say it any other way. I understand that. There's a kind of quiet you learn to live with after a loss like this. Not silence, just quiet. The difference is important. Silence feels like something's missing. Quiet is something you carry. Laura and I don't talk often, but when we do, it's kind. There's nothing left to argue about. She asked me recently if I'd ever think about moving back to Santa Cruz. I told her maybe. But for now, I still walk the trails around Sol Duke when the weather allows. Not every week. Just enough to remember the feel of the place. There's a stretch near Deer Lake where the wind sounds different, like it's coming from farther away than it should. That's where I go when I want to feel close to him. I don't visit the exact spot anymore, not because it's painful, but because it's finished. What I needed to do there, I did. I sat. I listened. I stood up and walked away. That was my part. His part was already done. Over time, the people who followed Jacob's story started to move on. The calls slowed, the questions faded. But every once in a while, someone still reaches out. A mother whose son vanished after a storm. A brother who never found a note. They always ask the same thing in different words. How do you go on when the ending makes no sense? And the truth is, you don't make sense of it. You stop asking it to make sense. You just make space for it to be what it is. A mark in the dirt. A trail that ends somewhere unexpected. And you decide what to carry forward and what to leave behind. For me, I carry the arrows, the ridge, the way Jacob lined up his boots before stepping into the unknown. I carry the fact that he was looking for something quiet, something true. And I try to honor that by not rushing to fill in what I'll never know. If you've stayed with me through this, thank you. For listening. For holding space for a story that didn't end with answers, but with meaning. If it stirred something in you, maybe someone you miss or a road you never followed, feel free to share it. Sometimes just saying the name helps it stay lit. Jacob Mercer. He went up, and I still hear him in the wind.